Hello and welcome to Interpreting India. I'm Srinath Raghavan, and this is a podcast presented by Carnegie India. Every 2 weeks, we bring to you voices from India and around the world as we unpack the role of technology, the economy, and foreign policy in shaping India's relationship with the world. In the light of the recent coronavirus outbreak, we are now recording and producing episodes of Interpreting India remotely. As India locked down to tackle the coronavirus, hundreds and thousands of migrants working in the country's urban centers were left with no income and little social security. Consequently, they were forced to return to their homes, experiencing extraordinary privations as public transportation was unavailable. It's been nearly 5 months since this crisis began unfolding. With the economy reopening now, some migrant workers have been able to return to the cities for work. But for many others, the continuing economic slump has precluded this possibility. The situation is further complicated by the desire of many migrants to stay put in their homes owing to concerns about the pandemic as well as its economic toll. In this episode of Interpreting India, we examine the impact of the migrant crisis on Indian economy and society. How has the crisis impinged on India's urban and rural labor markets? How effective has the government's response been? And what does this crisis hold for India's historical patterns of internal migration? Joining us today to discuss the implications of this crisis is Professor Chinmay Tumbe. Chinmay is an assistant professor of economics at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He holds a master's degree from the London School of Economics and a doctorate from the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. Chinmay has worked in academic, corporate, and government institutions in India, Britain, and Italy. He has also served on an interministerial working group on migration, and his research has featured in journals, newspapers, and policy portals. He's the author of the book, India Moving, A History of Migration, published in 2018. Chinmay's research interests include migration studies, urban economics, business, and economic history. Chinmay, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you here today.
Hi, thanks for having me over.
Chinmay, can we begin by talking a little bit about what you see as the sort of main features and developments in the migrant crisis that began in April? I mean, what are the reasons that this took place in the first place? How has it evolved in the subsequent months? Initially we saw a lot of imagery and reportage about the sort of difficulties that the migrants were experiencing, particularly in getting back to their homes and so on. But since then, clearly the story has moved off the front pages. So I was just wondering if you could give us an overview really of how you see the story as having panned out over the past few months.
Yeah, firstly, it was quite a remarkable situation we had for nearly 2 or 3 months, where we, for the first time in 150 years, shut down the Indian Railways, which I think was done at a very, very quick notice, which basically just stranded literally millions of people in their works. And of course, that was deliberate in order to keep the virus in check and so on. But I think the announcement that was done over the lockdown really didn't have much of a plan option or planning in place for the migrants, which was very surprising because there was at least one government report in 2017 and the economic survey numbers in 2016, which clearly showed the staggering scale of internal migration and the paucity of social security schemes when people are on the move in India. So this is not the case that the government didn't know. Clearly, and those were well publicized numbers and reports. So it was a bit of a surprise as to how there was absolutely no sort of planning in place for migrants. And not surprisingly, you saw a very rational response because people, the migrants, circular migrants in particular, if their income stream is sort of stopped, then the most rational response is to try and go back home, because that's where the family support is, that's where the social security is. So even if you want free ration and so on, that's where going back home is much more convenient. It didn't help that there was a lot of interstate sort of coordination mess. So some states allowed people to come back for a few days, few weeks. Some states did not. And so it became a very sordid saga in the end. And what we saw then finally was desperation. I think the fundamental problem was there was no credibility of the deadline. So when they first announced the lockdown, they said 3 weeks. And it was until April 15th or so. And I remember that, there were rumors in the first week that the lockdown would be postponed. And the government said, no, there are no rumors. It's going to be April 15th, come what may. And very quickly that, then as as it panned out, it just kept getting extended. So that was the credibility crisis. That is, since people did not know how long they're going to be in this vulnerable state, they just began to walk. And so I think that was really the tipping point. That is, you could not see how long this is going to last. And that is why I feel the government should have let the migrants go back in the first week itself with some time. But that's anyway post facto kind of reasoning. So in terms of the scale, are quite staggering. Most people putting in the numbers in tens of millions, not just millions. I've put the number at 30 million in terms of people going back, both interstate and intrastate. And just the number that we know from the Shramik trains was about 5 million. So we know that 5 million definitely went back in the trains, but we know a lot of them went before the trains. And so the numbers are staggering. And the way they went back, it was really literally seen since partition, where, you see these long corridors of people walking and so on. So quite a horrific incident. In my view, completely unnecessary. We literally created a crisis within a crisis. Yes, there is a pandemic. It calls for, it's a once in a kind of century kind of an event. But I don't think too many countries of the world, had a migration crisis. And I believe this happened because whatever the merits or demerits of a strict lockdown that we did eventually on March 24th, not giving the option for migrant workers to go back, I think was a big mistake. And then once you've taken the decision of containing people in the place they're supposed to be, not having a clear communication on what kind of benefits you're going to give was the second blunder. And so, eventually, of course, what happened was that migrants went back in the month of May when the infection rates were much higher. So it kind of did not really, the original purpose of not letting migrants go back was that they'll spread the disease. But as it turned out, they were allowed to go back 2 months later when the infection rates were high. So, again, it didn't really make sense in terms of what the government was thinking. The only sort of rational way one could defend those policies was that maybe rural areas were simply not prepared for a quick influx of infected people back home. And so those 2 months gave them a time to, ramp up facilities and so on. Maybe there's some merit in that argument. But I do think that the government sort of overestimated the infection rate in March. Now, on hindsight, clearly were flawed.
Right. Chinmay, the comparison that you made to partition and the kind of, flow of people that we saw then, in some ways is a very striking comparison. But it also seems to me that on this occasion, unlike, say, what happened at the time of partition, where the movement of people was actually geographically quite localized, if you look at it, right? Obviously the scale and the convulsions were phenomenal, but, the movement was actually in many ways geographically fairly localized, whereas what we saw here was at a more or less a very large kind of peninsular and North Indian scale, right? And it seems to me that the crisis is really, in a way, put the spotlight on, in terms of showing us how the economy is constituted, which is how these patterns of migration are in some ways so central to the way that our economy functions. As you quite rightly say, some of these data have been known. The economic survey of 2016, to which I think you also contributed, if I'm not mistaken, did put out some of these things in considerable number. But I think, like all crises, when one of the good things about crises is that, we learn to look at our systems from angles that previously might have escaped us. And it seems to me that, this crisis really thrown into sharp relief the importance of migration cycles and remittances to various parts and regions of India. So I'm just wondering, what has been the impact in terms of, economic impact, particularly on those regions which are sending outward migrants and receiving remittances, and the reversal of this phenomenon in such a sudden and sharp way?
Yeah, it's been quite tremendous. It's hard to give an exact number, but the remittance economy of India, the internal remittance economy of India, runs in tens of billions of dollars in equivalent terms. We say about $70 billion comes to India as international remittances, and a number not as big as that, but somewhere in that ballpark is domestic remittances. And what we basically seen is a complete shutdown of those remittances now for literally 4 months. So it has a huge impact. It has a huge impact on rural economies sustained by remittances. Kerala in terms of international remittances, but mainly we're talking of coastal Orissa, we're talking of eastern UP, we're talking of Bihar, we're talking of parts of Madhya Pradesh, we're talking of large parts of Rajasthan, large parts of Uttarakhand. It's complete remittance hill economy. So the remittance economy of India, I've estimated it affects about 20% of households in rural India. So 1 in 5 households in rural India has been really affected by just this complete sort of switching off the tap of remittances. And that is why you're seeing, at least some migrants come back now because they realize how important the jobs are, how important remittances are. So there's absolutely no doubt that, there's an economic knock-on effect. And I'll just give you an example. Even before the pandemic, for example, this going back home has happened in the past whenever there was an industrial recession, but they were localized. And of course, the trains were working at that time, so they didn't have to suffer the journey. So, for example, in Surat, Surat is completely linked to, a huge part of it is a diamond industry. A huge part of it is the synthetic textile industry. And so whenever there was a recession, people would just go back home because there's no work available. So it's a classic response of migrants to go back home. And whenever the Surat's economy would be hit, you would find a knock-on effect in Ganjam, in coastal Orissa, which sends a lot of people to Surat. You would find an impact on Bhavnagar and Bareilly districts in Gujarat, which send people to Surat. So the Surat's economy is linked to the international economy, but it's also, linking itself to the economies of Ganjam, economies of Bhavnagar and Bareilly. And so the same thing has happened now. Surat, of course, is devastated. The labor force, went back eventually in May. There were, literally protests and so on out there during the crisis because, something like 60% of the workforce there comes from outside. So when these people have gone back now, it has really shut down the remittance supply. And so those source regions, 1 in 5 households in rural India are really, really badly affected by this migrant crisis. And that is why I think the pressure, when people say, what policy options exist, I think the pressure to go back to the cities is immense because there is considerable distress thanks to that. I should mention, though, there is a migration season. There is a calendar of migration. And people do go back in the month of June and July every year for the monsoon season. So in that sense, like the construction industry, it goes in a small standstill during June and July every year because of the monsoon. And labor also goes back. And after the monsoon, when they finish the sowing and so on, they come back. So there is a seasonality to the large circular migration that we're seeing. What is different this year is that people have gone back a month or two earlier. And, they might come back on time or they might come back a bit later. So it's disrupted that migration calendar. And that's why the economies of the month of May, when unlock started, there's literally no labor, which was unexpected. In June and July, the construction industry anyway anticipates a shortage of labor because anyway people go back. But I think April and May was, completely unanticipated. So huge knock-on effect in the source region.
Right. And clearly, the economy is slowly coming back into activity. But, various sectors are going to take, different timescales by which they may even come back to anything approximating the sort of pre-lockdown kind of levels of activity, right? And it's not even clear what the impact of this prolonged period of economic lockdown will have on the sustainability of many of these businesses and even perhaps of industries, right? Things like construction industry seem to be in pretty deep water. So how should we then think about, the resumption of, migratory flows back into urban labor centers, given that the economy is not going to come back in one big bang, right? It's going to sort of shift its shape considerably as it tries to get back to something approximating what happened before the lockdown happened.
Yeah, I think right now the economy is still operating. At the peak, we're saying about 15 to 20% of the urban workforce just emptied out. And that's clearly not resumed at full capacity right now because a lot of people are still back home. I think what you said is really right, that it's not that the economy will just go back on full swing and there's just a lot of bankruptcies, a lot of firm closures which will happen. So the migrant, when in the coming months, migrants will come back in my view, but there will be fewer opportunities now in urban areas. So it's going to be, there will be some guys. I think the way it will pan out is through these social networks that the migrants come with. So there is one migrant stream which is extremely contractor based. Now that's interesting because a lot of them have lost faith in contractors because the contractors just completely abandoned them during the crisis. So that's also an interesting thing. What happens to the contractor in the construction industry? But the bulk of the workforce, the whole sort of Swiggy economy or the drivers, the plumbers, this whole informal economy, they are not really coming through contractors. They are coming through family friend networks. And so what you see is, few people going from the family or the friends, and then they will sort of on the phone say, "How you can come now," or wait for a month. So those kind of social network channels will kind of mediate the demand and supply of labor. In the construction industry, wherever the demand is needed, in fact, I would say this is a great time to be labor, because what you're seeing is this huge incentivization or literally pampering of labor to get them back. So you're seeing people being literally airlifted, given bonuses, benefits, because there's just such a shortage of labor in cities. So it's an interesting time, because in certain projects which have to be started, like metro projects in various cities and so on, you need that construction labor, and so you need to invest in the safety of those workers to get them back. I think what firms have to do when they have the cash is to really ensure that basic health. So for example, they should take the onus of testing. They should take the onus of providing basic health provisions, and ensure workers that these are safe conditions, because that's the only worry for workers before coming back. I mean, workers would love to come back right now, but they do have a worry that what if we get the disease. And so that kind of safety kind of communication has to be conveyed by the employers. Overall, I do think though that a lot of them, I think let's just put it this way: the situation in rural areas is much worse in terms of the employment scene now that everyone has gone back than urban areas. So people will still come back. You're right that there'll be firm closures, but using this social network kind of mediation, I think this is how the demand supply is going to sort of kind of match itself in the coming months.
Sure. And in the meanwhile, how does the situation in the rural economy look to you? I mean, this very high level of reverse migration, I mean, the numbers which you're talking about is staggering, right? I mean, clearly has been a huge sort of influx back home. And yes, the reported numbers of rural workforce have gone up, but clearly it's not very obvious to me that the rural economy is capable of suddenly absorbing these many numbers of people. And clearly a lot of people are reporting that they are working, but perhaps not working at all. And then the government has to amp up various kinds of, support schemes, etc. So what exactly is your reading of how the rural economy has coped with this reverse flow of migration?
Yeah, see, I think it's again the timing, the seasonality. We've not seen any major events and so on, precisely because the last 3 months were June, July, August, which is the classic, agricultural season. So in that sense, that's kind of absorbed that labor. I mean, obviously we're saying that people could have done all that agricultural work with none of this labor force which has come back, but it's like an additional help in the family. So, people are doing all those kind of tasks and so on. I think now the real problem starts, from September onwards. This is the non-seasonal aspect of the migration. So from now on, every day is very unusual for the migrant worker who has gone back, because from September onwards, they're usually not back home. So now I think you're going to really see these cries of unemployment sort of play out. And of course, there'll be elections in a few states. And I think this will be a huge issue, of giving jobs and so on. Now, so far, state governments have, tried to roll out packages, this, that. I mean, just the numbers are just too much, I mean, firstly, these are migrations with literally, I've argued, more than 100-year histories. They cannot be like shut down, overnight. There's a cultural aspect of migration, and also the fact that these are very strongly networked. I think what will happen is a lot of migration networks will change in terms of destinations. So it's not the case that a lot of these places will reduce out migration, but they might choose new destinations. So if Delhi treated you badly and your friend says, Bangalore was much better, let's go to Bangalore. So in past, and I'm saying this because in past shocks, this is what has happened. So whenever you've had shocks, the source regions, I mean, there's a particular dynamic to that out migration. So in India, in the last 100 years, the source regions have been pretty much the same, because fundamentally it's driven by population density, or calamities like in coastal Orissa, it's cyclones, or in Bihar, it's the floods. And so density and those calamities have, created those pressures to outmigrate. But the destinations have changed over time. So Punjab was a big attraction for Biharis. Now they're going down south. Similarly, a lot of Biharis, for example, are going to the Gulf also. So I think that the destinations are more likely to change based again on these social networks and the information passed on there. The other stuff which state governments are doing, I mean, what state governments can do is to if you're asking what can source region state governments do, I think this is a good time to really invest in some of their key cities instead of trying to focus on rural development and absorb that labor. That I don't think that's a really feasible task. It's just not enough I mean, just too many people basically to give any meaningful jobs. I mean, you're seeing the reports on Manrega. Manrega is for a particular class of workers. The bulk of the people who've gone back will simply not do Manrega. It's as simple as that. When you're earning so much in the city, so much more in the city, you will not bend down to do Manrega work. There is, of course, a class of workers which are taking Manrega, and it's at record highs, but the bulk of the people will not do Manrega work. So what it means is that, and this is, they're saying that India lacks urban infrastructure, India lacks good investment in cities. If state governments actually are interested in the source region, they should, so in Bihar, for example, Patna should be the magnet for a lot of migrants who would otherwise go to Bombay. Of course, the problem is that, as we know from the fiscal crisis, there's simply no money. So there's literally little that the governments as of now can do to, sort of shore up the economy. And I think that's what you're seeing slowly. Bihar, UP, initially they announced a lot of, schemes and policies, skill mapping, this, that. But eventually they're just going to leave it to market forces and say, please, leave the state as soon as possible and get jobs and send back money to us. I think that's really what's going to happen.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point, because at this point of time, the states are in a fiscally much worse situation than the central government is. So it's going to be difficult for them to pick up the slack, so to speak. But you also make a very important point about, what kind of overall patterns of economic development should we think about? And that's a question I want to come back to towards the very end. But it strikes me that one of the other sort of aspects of our existence that this crisis has sensitized us to is the almost abject failure of social security schemes. We have things like the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act, somewhat inappropriately named for our times, but which is supposed to be protecting the rights of migrant workers. But it's very clear that none of these have really paid off in the face of such a big crisis. And I'm just wondering, what do you think the government is trying to do in order to promote the resumption of economic activity? Are there more things that they can do? I've heard some kind of talk of, the government perhaps bringing in something like an urban equivalent of an Employment Guarantee Act. So do you think that's going to help?
I'll be very curious to know how. I know there's a lot of efforts towards doing this, or at least think tanks are now coming up with proposals and so on. I think historically it was never there because very tough. It's really tough to think of government program in cities. And then when all state governments are so hostile to migrants, when you provide an urban, there's a serious issue here of who are you giving the jobs to, because it's going to attract more migrants. And then when states are passing these anti-migrant kind of policies, it's not an easy thing to sell politically. You might say you're giving jobs, but it's also going to create this hostility towards migrants. So maybe some people will find phenomenal ways of implementing, but I'm very skeptical of that route. I think if you look at what urban governments can do, I would imagine it to provide the basic facilities to have safe operations and allow migrants to come back and get. That's the least one can do at this time. So beyond that, there's little. I think in terms of policies, the big policies is One Nation, One Ration Card policy in terms of social sector. Now, if you mentioned the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act of the 1970s, unfortunately, that anyway covers a very small fraction of the overall migrant workforce. It's because, again, that's based on this contractor-based migrations that registration should happen and so on. But the bulk of the migration doesn't cover or is not covered under the Interstate Migration Workmen Act. So I see there's a new proposal by the Labour Department at the central government, trying to do something for migrants, and I think that's in the right direction. But the big potential game changer could be this One Nation, One Ration, and I think I'm more inclined towards that rather than firms doing anything. So the government chipping in, and what that would do is basically right now your social security is tied to where you're born, or max. Some states have intrastate, so you go from say Jalgaon in Maharashtra to Mumbai, same state. You can access ration and everything in Mumbai, but interstate has never been there, and so that has started on the pilot basis. But they must be teething problems with that. And again, there I foresee a fiscal problem. Because now if you say that, the Biharis get free ration and other benefits in Mumbai, that is an incentive for more of them to come to Mumbai. And how does the Maharashtra state government then deal with it? Or they're going to say that why should we be paying welfare services for these guys? So again, there is a massive, a fiscal federal kind of a crisis. And I've argued that maybe just like the GST, of course, now the GST council doesn't seem to be working too well, but we've never really thought of an interstate migration council or some sort of a dispute mechanism settlement issue, which I think might be needed once this one nation, one ration card issue comes up. So they've got a good idea in mind. Note, I mean, this idea has been there for over a decade, and hopefully now this crisis has forced them to kind of get it out as soon as possible. But I think that's a good policy in the sense that, if this one nation, one ration is there, and you can actually, as a migrant worker, access basic food and so on anywhere in India, then you would not have seen such a mad rush to go home on March 24th. Right? I mean, you if you're insured, and I would say that don't make it just a PDS thing, make it across the board. Right now, for example, women who come to cities don't have access to ASHA facilities and so on, Anganwadis in the city. So many of women actually go back to the villages to access health facilities there because the cities are very hostile for outsiders who can't show proof of residence. So portability of social security benefits, I think that should be the mantra. One of that is one nation, one ration, but I think it should be across the board. It should be for health, it should be for education, it should be for practically, everything. Closely related to that is, of course, voting. Can migrants vote in cities? And I think that's also a big deal because, and this is just some recent work by political scientists which show that, politicians don't care for migrant workers because they're simply not a constituency base in cities. So that is also another issue that historically public goods have been undersupplied to migrants because they are not a sort of catchment vote. It's not a catchment for votes. So one level is portability of social security benefits so that in future crises like this, people can stay out in the cities for at least a few weeks. I mean, what we've seen now is that literally a few days and there's vulnerability. And the other thing is for migrants to be a bit more invested in cities. For that, they should be able to vote. And so I would say residence-based voting for municipal elections might be also, a good idea.
Yeah, sure. Though I can see why that might be politically quite controversial, right? I mean, because as you're saying, it's ironic, right? At one level, migrants don't matter in politics, but they only matter to the extent that they can be cast as the other or demonized. You and I come from Mumbai, and we know, how that politics played out here, or how it is playing out today in places like Madhya Pradesh, right? I mean, where the government has come out openly and said that we are basically going for a so-called what in the old days would be called a sons of the soil kind of policy and so on.
Correct. And a lot of states. I mean, it's just
absolutely.
You've seen Andhra Pradesh. It's now become the norm. And what's interesting is it's not a very binding constraint. So it's not like when they announce this, it really affects anybody. But just that rhetoric is a very nativist rhetoric, which is also anti-constitutional. And there have been court cases in the past where state governments have lost these cases. So if somebody files some case, it's not quite likely that any of these laws actually pass the legal muster. But that's the sort of fad now, which is unfortunately caught on.
Yeah, though there have been exceptions like Telangana. The Telangana chief minister made some very enlightened statements about migrant workers in his state and so on. So I suppose, but politics will play.
Yeah, like Gujarat, where I'm based right now, depends hugely on migrant workers. Now, they don't have the best record in providing, benefits and so on. But at least you see very little anti-migrant rhetoric. Once in a while, it might come. But compared to, say, Maharashtra, in both Gujarat and Maharashtra, hugely depend on interstate migrant labor. But Gujarat has been much more, you don't see that sort of open hostility now. But I think there's interestingly now more calls on, providing more benefits. Because if you saw where, a lot of the protests took place, it was basically Delhi, Surat and Mumbai. And, Delhi, Surat, Mumbai are similar in that a huge part of the workforce is migrant. Huge part of them come from other states and a huge part of them come from rural areas, which is not the case in terms of Hyderabad, Chennai, Bangalore, Pune, which so-called IT hubs now, because there actually the bulk of the workforce comes from other cities of India. So the sort of compositional character of the migrant workforce is very different in Mumbai, Surat and Delhi vis-a-vis these other top 10 cities. Then, of course, there's an issue of small towns and migrants out there. But in the big 10 cities, that is why I've argued that these three cities saw a lot of the protests. in this particular crisis.
So to round it all off, Chinmay, I was just thinking of a kind of a macro question, which seems to me to be interesting about the broader political economy of what migration might mean in the context of India, right? So here is my proposition. Now, as you rightly point out, this crisis has shown us, in some ways, it has been like an X-ray sort of photograph of the patterns of migration in India. And what emerges is that there are certain states, particularly in what in the olden days would be called the Gangetic Valley, right? I mean, in North India, which are the main sources of migration outflows. And most of these migrants are actually going to work in the more prosperous states of Western and Southern India, right? And as you're saying, in some ways, our entire imaginary of economic development has far moved away from, say, the idea that you need regional development. If you think back to the debates of the 1960s and 70s, the idea that we need more sort of regionally equitable kind of economic growth used to be a very main thing. Every planning commission note would sort of talk about those kinds of things. But all of that has clearly fallen off the map. And, scholars like Anush Kapadia point out that this is a bit of a colonial kind of a situation, right? Where there are poor areas of India which are exporting human capital and in turn getting remittances. And it's not clear to me that this trend, at least in its underlying sort of demographic patterns, is going to get reversed. I mean, we just saw the numbers coming out, and it's very clear that the states which are today supplying maximum amount of migrants are the ones which are likely to see great increases in population over the next decade as well. So I'm just wondering, I mean, how do we then, think about newer patterns of creating more perhaps regional hubs of economic growth and dynamism, rather than this very kind of skewed pattern of, one part of India being the main supplier of labor power and others basically consuming it and then remittances flowing back, all of which, at least this crisis shows, can in certain contexts become quite unsustainable. And of course, the toxic politics which has gone with it.
Yeah, I mean, just to give an example, for example, this Mumbai-Delhi infrastructure corridor. This is whole corridor which goes from Ahmedabad, Jaipur, Delhi. I mean, this has been in the news for a long time and so on.
Yeah.
And at that time, I mean, the classic question was, why couldn't you? I mean, these were places which were already well connected and everything. If you had, I mean, India's problem is, or what India needs really is a Delhi to Calcutta economic corridor. I mean, that is really the heartland of poverty in India. India's big problem is we don't have a big metropolis in that entire circle between Delhi and Calcutta. I mean, if you look at India's big city map, and this was not, true 100 years back, where you had Lucknow and Allahabad and many of these places, relatively in relative terms, fairly big, but they've just fallen off the map in relative terms. And that is why, people are around Patna are not going to Patna, but people are going to Mumbai and so. Now, so when you talk of regional development, I'm not in favor of a completely, even sort of, let's call it a Gandhian view where let's just focus on rural development. If you focus on the village as a unit, then, if you develop all the villages, there'll be no need for people to leave. I think the evidence suggests that, with more development, more people are actually going out, leaving village. So village as a unit of analysis, in my view, is, not appropriate. Neither is a small town. I think it's a city. And so what state government should do, or even the central government, is to really activate some of the big cities as magnets. So if you're looking for regional development, I think we made the mistake of looking at the village as a unit of development, but look at the city. So each state government, so what I would prefer, so I don't have a problem if some states of India are going to pull ahead and pull this migration, migrant labor and so on, as long as if we have, reasonably large and dynamic cities in every state of India, that would form at least one magnet for the people within that state to go to. I think that's probably a more plausible idea than what has happened. And that would help the state itself. So if Patna, Lucknow, if Raipur, these become large cities, they have a massive sort of spillover effect. So my take on this is the unit of analysis should not be the village or the district, but it should be having at least one or two large cities in those states. Now, how do you activate those large cities? You probably need investment, and you probably need to create those clusters, which now Gujarat is doing with IT, GIFT, and so on out there. But I'll just point out this migration model of development and so on. There is a reality that the Gangetic heartland of India has got very high rural population density. And that's because of, it's been habited. I mean, there's continuous habitation for centuries and so on. And which is very similar to Kerala. And so, one way to look at this is Kerala today also has, though Kerala has these fantastic indicators and everything, a huge part of its workforce works in the Gulf. And so this is a sort of example I keep giving, that is, Bihar would take several decades to reach where Kerala is just today. But there is absolutely no reason or expectation that we should see Bihar's out-migration reduce as it starts developing. I think what we should just focus on is improving the quality of out-migration in these particular states. And so Kerala has been a remittance economy for decades now. And these migrations will eventually stop. When will these migrations eventually stop? It's when the demographic transition plays itself out. That is when fertility starts falling off. Then the pressure on the land will reduce, and then the migration stop. And that is why today Kerala, where the fertility rates are one of the lowest in India, now the migrations have started slowing down. After 30 years of mass migration, they are now started slowing down automatically from within, because there are fewer people being born in Kerala. So this migration story is going to stay with us. Whatever we do, even if we invest in states, even if we invest in cities, I think it will attract people there. But I think in our lifetimes, there is simply no way that the out migrations from Bihar, Eastern UP, and some of these clusters will reduce. But yes, I do hope that you will see Patna, Lucknow, and many of these urban clusters grow to be as big and as dynamic as some of the other cities which have emerged.
Chinmay, it was great to chat with you. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you for listening to this episode of Interpreting India. Stay safe and don't forget to wash your hands. For more information about the podcast and the production team, you can follow us on social media and visit our webpage.